July 16th, 1212, the Sierra Morena Mountains, southern Spain. The heat rose from the rocks like a living thing, waves of it shimmering, making the horizon dance. The smell of 60,000 men and 30,000 horses packed into a mountain valley, sweat, leather, steel, and fear. And above it all, the sound that had terrified Europe for 5 centuries, the war drums of Islam. King Alfonso VIII of Castile stood at the edge of the Christian camp, looking south toward the pass they needed to cross. Beyond those mountains, somewhere in the plains of Andalusia, waited an army 3 times the size of his own, an army that had never lost, an army led by a man who called himself the mirror of princes, the victorious, the defender of the faith, Muhammad al-Nasir, Caliph of the Almohad Empire, ruler of North Africa and Muslim Spain, the most powerful man in the Western Mediterranean. And Alfonso was about to pick a fight with him. From a letter Alfonso wrote to Pope Innocent III, preserved in the Vatican archives, "We march not for glory, but for survival. If we fail, Christian Spain dies. If we stand idle, Christian Spain dies slower, so we choose the manner of our dying and pray God turns it into victory." This is the story of how one desperate charge up an impossible hill broke the back of Islamic power in Europe. Not because of a miracle, not because God chose sides, but because sometimes, when you have nothing left to lose, you find something worth dying for. And that's more dangerous than any army. But to understand why this battle mattered, we need to go back. Back to when Alfonso was young and arrogant, back to when he thought he could stop an empire alone, back to the day everything went wrong. July 19th, 1195. Alarcos, central Spain. Alfonso VIII was 39 years old and had been king of Castile since he was 3. He'd spent his entire adult life fighting the Moors, the Muslim kingdoms that controlled southern Spain. He'd won battles, taken castles, pushed the frontier south inch by bloody inch. He thought he understood war. Then he met the Almohads. The Almohads weren't like the earlier Muslim kingdoms in Spain. Those had been fragmented, cultured, prone to infighting. The Almohads were different. They were fundamentalists, Puritans, warriors who believed that Islam had grown soft and needed to be purified through conquest and blood. They'd swept out of the Atlas Mountains of Morocco in the 1120s, conquered North Africa, crossed into Spain, and crushed every Muslim ruler who didn't meet their standards of religious purity. By 1195, they controlled everything from the Sahara to the Tagus River. And they weren't done. The Almohad Caliph Abu Yusuf al-Mansur, the victorious, crossed into Castilian territory with an army estimated at over 100,000 men, cavalry from the Sahara, Berber infantry from the Atlas Mountains, elite Black Guard units from sub-Saharan Africa, and behind them the war drums that announced Islamic conquest. Alfonso should have waited, should have called for allies, should have let al-Mansur besiege a fortress, while Christian reinforcements arrived from Aragon, Navarre, Leon. Instead, Alfonso marched out to meet him with barely 25,000 men. He was confident. Castilian knights were the best heavy cavalry in Europe. Christian soldiers fought with the desperation of men defending their homes. God was on their side. God apparently had other plans. The Battle of Alarcos lasted less than 4 hours. The Almohad cavalry, lighter and faster than Castilian knights, refused to engage in direct charges. They circled, harassed, drew the Christian cavalry out of formation. Then the Almohad infantry, disciplined, patient, veteran, closed the trap. Alfonso's army didn't just lose, it disintegrated. Thousands of Castilian knights died in the dust. The military orders, Templars, Hospitallers, the Order of Calatrava, were shattered. Alfonso himself barely escaped, riding through the night with a handful of survivors. The fortress of Alarcos fell. Then Calatrava. Then a dozen other towns. Al-Mansur didn't just defeat Alfonso, he humiliated him. sent captured Christian banners back to Marrakech as trophies, sold thousands of prisoners into slavery, and he made Alfonso sign a peace treaty that was really a surrender. Castile would pay tribute, would cede territory, would acknowledge that the Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian campaign to reclaim Spain, was over. Alfonso returned to his capital of Toledo a broken man. The chroniclers say he went into seclusion for months, refused to hold court, spent his days in the chapel praying or weeping or both. He was 40 years old. He'd lost his army, his reputation, and his faith in his own judgment, but he hadn't lost his memory, and he swore before God and every saint in heaven that he would have his revenge. It took him 17 years. During those 17 years, Alfonso did something remarkable. He stopped being a warrior king and became a strategic king. He didn't charge out to fight every border skirmish. He built alliances, married his daughters to the kings of Aragon and Portugal, funded the reconstruction of the military orders, stockpiled weapons and trained new soldiers. And he waited. Because Al-Mansur was old, and old men die. In 1199, Al-Mansur died of natural causes. His son, Al-Nasir, inherited the Almohad Empire. Al-Nasir was young, ambitious, and eager to prove he was as great as his father. He looked north at Christian Spain and saw unfinished business. By 1211, Al-Nasir had assembled the largest army North Africa had ever sent to Europe. The numbers are disputed. Chroniclers on both sides exaggerated, but modern historians estimate somewhere between 120,000 and 180,000 fighting men, infantry, cavalry, engineers, a baggage train that stretched for miles. And this time, Al-Nasir didn't plan to raid. He planned to conquer, to push the Christians back to the Pyrenees, to turn Spain into a purely Islamic land once and for all. Word reached Alfonso in the spring of 1212. The Almohad army was crossing the Strait of Gibraltar, gathering at Seville, preparing to march north. Alfonso was 56 years old. His hair was grey. His body carried the scars of 40 years of war. But when he heard the news, the chroniclers say he smiled. Finally, a chance to erase Alarcos, to prove that the disaster 17 years ago was a fluke, not a verdict. He sent messengers to every Christian kingdom in Spain, to Aragon, Navarre, Leon, Portugal. He sent letters to the Pope in Rome, begging for this to be declared a crusade, which would bring knights from across Europe. Pope Innocent III agreed. He declared the campaign a holy war, promised spiritual rewards equivalent to fighting in the Holy Land, ordered the archbishops of Spain to preach recruitment. Knights came. Not as many as Alfonso hoped. Most European nobles were busy with their own wars, but enough. Templars and Hospitallers, French knights looking for glory, Portuguese volunteers, and most importantly, the kings of Aragon and Navarre, with their own armies. By June 1212, Alfonso had assembled approximately 60,000 men. Still outnumbered, still facing an enemy that had crushed him before, but no longer alone. The Christian army gathered at Toledo in late June. 3 kings, Alfonso of Castile, Pedro II of Aragon, Sancho VII of Navarre, hundreds of noblemen, thousands of knights, tens of thousands of infantry, many of them peasants who'd been promised land and salvation if they fought. There were also volunteers. Not soldiers, just men, farmers who brought their own weapons, merchants who'd never held a sword, old men who remembered when the Moors had raided their villages decades ago and wanted revenge before they died. The army that left Toledo on June 20th wasn't professional. It was a mob with banners, united by faith, fear, and the understanding that this might be their last chance to stop Islamic expansion in Europe. They marched south, through the scorching plains of La Mancha, through dust that caked in their throats and heat that killed horses. They were heading for the mountain passes of the Sierra Morena, the only route south to where Al-Nasir waited. And as they marched, men deserted, not cowards, just realists, French crusaders, who'd expected a quick campaign, decided this Spanish summer heat wasn't worth salvation and went home. Noblemen had disputes over who should command which flank and took their retinues and left. By the time the Christian army reached the foothills of the Sierra Morena in mid-July, they'd lost nearly 20,000 men, not to battle, to heat, disease, and second thoughts. Alfonso didn't stop them. He knew something they didn't. That desperation is a better weapon than numbers. That an army of men who've already committed to death fights harder than an army of men still negotiating with survival. The Christians needed to cross the Sierra Morena. It was the only way to reach the open plains where Al-Nasir waited. But the mountains were a natural fortress, steep passes, narrow defiles, easy to defend, hell to attack, and Al-Nasir had gotten there first. The Almohad army held the pass at Despeñaperros, the overthrow of dogs, named for how easy it was to slaughter anyone trying to force through. Al-Nasir had positioned cavalry and archers on the heights, infantry blocking the pass itself. Anyone trying to push through would be slaughtered from above. Alfonso's scouts reported back. The pass was impassable. Any attack would be suicide. The army couldn't go forward, and it couldn't stay where it was. They were running out of food. Water was scarce. The summer heat was killing men and horses daily. If they retreated, the campaign was over. The alliance would collapse. Al-Nasir would invade Castile, and this time there'd be no one to stop him. Alfonso called a war council on the night of July 13th. The three kings, the masters of the military orders, the senior nobles. They gathered in Alfonso's tent and faced the impossible question: what do you do when you can't go forward and can't go back? Pedro of Aragon suggested negotiations. Maybe Al-Nasir would accept tribute instead of battle. Sancho of Navarre wanted to try forcing the pass at night. The Templars argued for a frontal assault, death or glory. Alfonso said nothing, just listened. Let them argue themselves into circles. Then, according to multiple chronicles, a shepherd appeared at the camp. A local man. He told the commanders he knew a path, not the main pass, a hidden trail through the mountains. Narrow, dangerous. But it would bring them out behind Al-Nasir's position. The nobles were suspicious. It could be a trap. The shepherd could be a spy. Even if he was genuine, marching an entire army through an unmapped mountain trail was insane. Alfonso looked at the shepherd, asked him why he was helping. The shepherd, his name is recorded as Martin al-Hajja, though some chronicles call him Martin of Biscay, said his family had been killed in an Almohad raid 20 years ago. He'd been living in these mountains ever since, and he wanted to see Christians kill Moors before he died. Alfonso believed him, or didn't care if it was a trap, because staying meant death, retreating meant death. At least this way, they'd die trying. The army broke camp before dawn on July 14th. They left their baggage train behind, took only weapons, water, and desperate hope, and followed the shepherd into the mountains. The trail was everything the shepherd promised and worse. Barely wide enough for two men walking side by side. Rocky, steep. In places, knights had to dismount and lead their horses by hand. In other places, the path ran along cliff edges where one wrong step meant a 100-foot fall. They marched for 2 days, through July 14th and 15th, in summer heat that turned armor into ovens, with no idea if they'd emerge into an ambush or empty air. And then, on the evening of July 15th, they came down out of the mountains onto the plains south of the pass, behind Al-Nasir's army. The Almohad scouts spotted them almost immediately. Riders galloped back to the main camp. Al-Nasir received the news and reportedly didn't believe it at first. An entire army had just appeared out of nowhere in a place where no army should be able to go. But there they were, 60,000 Christians, exhausted, thirsty, half dead from the march, but alive and in position. Al-Nasir had two choices. He could retreat south, regroup, fight on ground of his choosing. or he could turn his army around and crush these Christians before they recovered. He chose to fight because he had the numbers, because his cavalry was superior, because he was young and confident, and his father had beaten these same Christians 17 years ago, because he'd never lost. The two armies spent July the 16th maneuvering into position on a plateau called Las Navas de Tolosa, the meadows of Tolosa. The Christians held a low ridge on the north side. The Almohads held higher ground to the south, with al-Nasir's command post on a hill protected by his elite guards. Between them, a valley, a killing ground, where 60,000 Christians would face an army twice their size. Alfonso spent that night walking through his camp, talking to soldiers, praying with priests, making sure men had water and weapons and courage. The chronicles record him stopping at a group of young knights, boys really, barely old enough to grow beards, who were sharpening their swords by firelight. One of them asked Alfonso if he thought they'd win. Alfonso looked at the kid for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't know, but I know we'll fight, and if we die like men who refuse to kneel. That's enough." The boy reportedly started crying, not from fear, from the understanding that he was about to be part of something larger than his own life or death. And here's where I need to pause and tell you something important. If you're invested in this story, if you want to see how this impossible battle unfolds, you need to make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We specialize in these moments, the battles where everything hung in the balance, where small decisions had massive consequences, where history could have gone a completely different direction if just a few things had changed. Hit that subscribe button now, because what happens next at Las Navas de Tolosa is going to redefine what you think courage looks like. July 16th became July 17th. The sun rose over the Sierra Morena, painting the sky orange and red. The temperature climbed. The armies faced each other across the valley. And at dawn, the drums began. The Almohad war drums, deep, rhythmic, relentless. The sound that had announced Islamic conquest from India to Spain. The sound that had terrorized Christian Europe for 500 years. The Christian army heard those drums and knew this wasn't going to be a battle, it was going to be an apocalypse. Al-Nasir deployed his army in 3 lines. First, Andalusian volunteers, Muslims from Spain, lightly armored, expendable. Behind them, the North African regulars, Berber infantry, veteran and disciplined. And behind them on the hill, Al-Nasir's personal guard, thousands of them, the best warriors in the Almohad Empire, chained together at the ankles so they couldn't retreat even if they wanted to. It was psychological warfare. Soldiers who literally can't run, fight to the death. And watching them fight to the death breaks the enemy's will. The Christians deployed in 3 divisions. Left flank under Pedro of Aragon. Right flank under Sancho of Navarre. Center under Alfonso himself with the military orders, Templars, Hospitallers, Santiago, Calatrava, forming the core. 3 Christian kings against an empire. The battle began mid-morning. The Andalusian volunteers charged first. Thousands of them, screaming, rushing forward with spears and swords. They hit the Christian line like a wave hitting a cliff, and broke. The Christian heavy cavalry met them with lowered lances, ploughed through them. The Andalusians, brave but poorly equipped, died in hundreds. The survivors fled back toward their own lines, round 1 to the Christians. Then the real fighting started. The North African infantry advanced, not charging, marching, shields locked, drums beating time. Professional soldiers who'd conquered kingdoms and didn't scare easily. They hit the Christian center and stopped its momentum cold. Knights in full armor crashed into disciplined infantry with long spears and good shields. The fighting turned into a brutal grind, men hacking at each other in furnace heat. No maneuver, no tactics, just endurance and will. For 3 hours the center held, neither side advancing, neither side retreating, just dying. On the flanks, things were worse. Pedro of Aragon's division was being pushed back by Almohad cavalry. Sancho of Navarre's men were holding, but barely. The battle was turning into what al-Nasir wanted, a battle of attrition, where his superior numbers would eventually grind the Christians down. Alfonso, in the center, could see it happening. His army was going to lose. Not quickly, not dramatically, just slowly, inevitably, like sand running through an hourglass. He'd marched 60,000 men through mountains to die on a plateau in southern Spain. He'd gotten his rematch with the Almohads, and he was losing. Again. Then Alfonso made a decision, the kind of decision that defines kings and changes history. He looked at the hill where al-Nasir's command post sat, protected by thousands of elite guards, and he decided that if he was going to lose, he'd lose by charging straight at the enemy commander. Kill the head, maybe the body dies. He turned to the masters of the military orders, to the Templars, Hospitallers, and the Spanish orders, to the men who'd taken vows of poverty, chastity, and holy war, and he said 3 words, "Follow me, now." Then he spurred his horse toward the hill, and several thousand knights, men who'd spent their entire lives training for this exact moment, charged after him. Up the hill, into the teeth of al-Nasir's elite guard, into a wall of spears and swords and bodies chained together. It should have been suicide. It should have been the final, futile gesture of a king who refused to accept defeat. Instead, it changed everything. July 16th, 1212, Las Navas de Tolosa, 2:30 p.m. The sound of several thousand armored knights charging uphill is something between thunder and avalanche, hooves on rock, metal on metal, men screaming prayers and war cries, the ground shaking. Alfonso VIII led from the front, not behind his men, not directing from safety in front, where the arrows would hit first, where the spears would reach first, where death was most certain. Behind him, the military orders followed in wedge formation, Templars in their white mantles with red crosses, Hospitallers in black with white crosses, the Spanish orders, Santiago, Calatrava, Alcantara, in their own colors, men who'd trained their entire lives for this moment, who viewed death in battle as the highest possible honor. They hit the base of al-Nasir's hill at full gallop and ran straight into hell. The Almohad elite guard, al-Nasir's personal warriors, were called the Black Guard, veterans, fanatics. Many of them former slaves from sub-Saharan Africa who'd earned their freedom through military service and now fought with the fervor of men who'd lost everything and gained paradise as their reward. They were chained together at the ankles, not as punishment, as commitment. They literally couldn't retreat, couldn't step back, couldn't do anything except stand and kill or die. When the Christian charge hit them, it was like water hitting a dam. The first line of knights crashed into the Black Guard and stopped. Lances shattered, horses screamed and fell. Knights were pulled from their saddles by multiple defenders. The momentum that should have carried the charge up the hill died in the first 10 seconds. But Alfonso kept pushing. More knights poured into the gap, more bodies, more weight, more desperate violence. The military orders didn't fight like normal cavalry. They'd trained for this, fought in the Holy Land, studied Muslim tactics. They didn't rely on the shock of the charge. They used it to get close, then switched to swords and maces and started hacking. Close quarters, no room for fancy maneuvers, just butchery. Knights in full armor against warriors chained in place. Neither side could retreat, neither side would surrender. For 20 minutes, an eternity in medieval combat, the fighting at the base of the hill was a meat grinder. Men died standing up because the press of bodies was too tight to let them fall. The ground turned to mud, not from rain, from blood. Alfonso's horse was killed under him. He fell into the chaos. For a moment, chroniclers say, the King of Castile disappeared into the press of bodies. His guards thought he was dead. Then they saw him, on foot, sword in hand, fighting like a common soldier, not trying to command, not trying to direct, just trying to stay alive one heartbeat at a time. And something happened, something the chroniclers called divine intervention, but was really just psychology. The Christian knights saw their king fighting on foot in the middle of the enemy, and every man who saw it thought, if he won't retreat, I can't retreat. So they didn't. They pushed harder, died faster, and slowly, impossibly, started to drive forward. The Black Guard, chained in place, couldn't give ground even if they wanted to, but the Christian knights weren't asking them to retreat. They were just killing them where they stood. Yard by yard, body by body, the Christian wedge carved its way up the hill. On the flanks, Pedro of Aragon and Sancho of Navarre saw Alfonso's desperate charge, saw the military orders committed, saw the entire battle hinging on whether the center could break through. They made their own decision. Instead of holding defensive positions, they charged too, not toward Al-Nasir's hill, toward the flanks of the Almohad army that were now exposed because Al-Nasir had pulled reserves to defend his command post. It was all in. Every Christian soldier committed, no reserves, no fallback position, win or die. The Almohad commanders saw what was happening and tried to respond. They sent cavalry to relieve the hill, repositioned infantry to counter the flank attacks. But they were reacting. And in medieval warfare, whoever's reacting is losing. The battle turned into 3 separate fights happening simultaneously. On the left, Pedro's Aragonese were grinding through Almohad cavalry. On the right, Sancho's Navarrese were breaking through toward Al-Nasir's baggage train, and in the center, Alfonso and the military orders were climbing a hill over the bodies of men who wouldn't move. Al-Nasir, from his command post, could see it all, could see his elite guard, men who'd never broken, never retreated, being destroyed, could see his flanks collapsing, could see the entire battle slipping away. He had options. He could commit his final reserves, throw everything at the Christian center and try to stop Alfonso's advance. He could order a fighting retreat, pull back to regroup, force the Christians to chase him into prepared positions. He did neither. He panicked. At approximately 3:30 p.m., 5.5 hours after the battle began, Muhammad al-Nasir, Caliph of the Almohad Empire, commander of the faithful, mirror of princes, abandoned his army and fled. The man who'd claimed he would drive the Christians to the Pyrenees, who'd assembled the largest invasion force in a century, who'd never lost a battle, turned his horse around and ran. His personal guard was still fighting, still dying chained together at the base of his hill. But their commander was gone. When word spread, and in the chaos of medieval battle word spreads faster than you'd think, the Almohad army disintegrated, not retreated, disintegrated. Units that had been holding firm broke. Soldiers threw down weapons and ran. Officers tried to rally their men and were trampled by their own troops fleeing. The organized, disciplined army that had marched north from Seville turned into a mob, and the Christians pursued. This is where medieval warfare gets dark, because the real killing doesn't happen during the battle. It happens during the rout, when one side breaks and runs, and the other side chases them down from behind. The Christian cavalry, finally able to use their speed and weight, ran down fleeing Almohad soldiers by the thousands. Knights with lances skewered men from behind. Infantry slit the throats of wounded. The military orders, men of God who'd taken vows of mercy, showed none. The pursuit lasted until nightfall. The Christians chased the Almohads south for miles, across the plains, into the foothills. Anywhere a man tried to hide, they found him and killed him. The casualty numbers are disputed. Medieval chroniclers love to exaggerate, but the most conservative modern estimates say the Almohads lost between 40,000 and 60,000 men, killed in battle or hunted down afterward. The Christians lost somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. When darkness finally forced the Christians to stop, they returned to the battlefield, to the hill where al-Nasir's command post had stood, and they found something that would echo through history: al-Nasir's tent, abandoned. Inside, maps, orders, treasure, and his personal standard, a massive banner that had never touched the ground in defeat. Alfonso took the standard personally, cut it down, rolled it up. He would carry it back to Toledo as proof, as a trophy, as a message to every Muslim kingdom in Spain. Your emperor fled, your invincible army broke, your time is ending. But the real prize wasn't the banner. It was what the banner represented. Psychological destruction. The Almohad Empire had been built on a reputation that they were chosen by God, that they couldn't be defeated, that resistance was futile. Al-Nasir's father had crushed the Christians at Alarcos and made them pay tribute. Las Navas de Tolosa destroyed that reputation in a single afternoon. The Christian army camped on the battlefield that night, too exhausted to celebrate, too stunned by what they'd done to process it. Men sat among the dead, Christian and Muslim alike, and tried to understand how they were still alive. A Templar knight named Arnaud wrote a letter to his order's headquarters in Jerusalem. It survives in the order's archives. We climbed a hill of bodies and found an empire's heart. We cut it out. I do not know if this was God's will or the devil's, but I know I will never see anything like it again, and I hope I never do. The morning of July 17th revealed the scale of the victory. The plain was covered with dead, tens of thousands of them. Carrion birds were already circling. The smell was overwhelming. Alfonso ordered burial details. Christian dead first, buried with prayers and ceremony. Muslim dead in mass graves. It took 3 days. Some chroniclers say the locals were still finding bones decades later. But Alfonso didn't stay to oversee the burials. He couldn't. Al-Nasir had fled, but the Almohad Empire still existed. There were Muslim fortresses throughout southern Spain, armies that could be raised. Another invasion force assembled. The Christians had won a battle. They needed to turn it into a war-winning campaign. Alfonso led his army south. They marched through Andalusia, and everywhere they went, Muslim garrisons surrendered without fighting. Towns opened their gates. Fortresses sent envoys offering tribute, because news of Las Navas had spread, that Al-Nasir had fled, that his elite guard had been annihilated, that the invincible Almohads had been beaten by an enemy half their size. Fear is contagious. So is defeat. The Christian army reached Ubeda, a major fortress city, in late July. The garrison could have held for months. Instead, they surrendered after 3 days. Alfonso let the Muslim population leave safely, taking only what they could carry, then burned the city to the ground. Not out of cruelty, out of calculation. He wanted every Muslim kingdom in Spain to understand, this isn't a raid, this isn't a temporary victory, this is permanent. Your empire in Europe is ending. By August, the Christian army was exhausted. They'd been campaigning for 3 months in brutal summer heat. Disease was spreading through the camp. Men were dying of dysentery faster than they died in battle. Alfonso made the decision to end the campaign. They'd won Las Navas, taken Ubeda, proven that the Almohads could be beaten. That was enough for 1 year. The army disbanded. Pedro and Sancho took their forces home to Aragon and Navarre. The military orders returned to their commanderies. The volunteers who'd survived went back to their farms and shops, suddenly wealthy from looted Almohad treasure. Alfonso rode back to Toledo with Al-Nasir's banner and the knowledge that he'd finally, after 17 years, avenged Alarcos. But revenge wasn't the point. Not anymore. Las Navas had done something more important than settling a score. It had broken the back of Islamic power in Spain. Muhammad al-Nasir returned to Marrakech in disgrace. His empire, which had seemed eternal 6 months earlier, was in chaos. Provincial governors rebelled. Subject kingdoms declared independence. The army that had marched into Spain with drums and confidence came back as refugees telling stories of disaster. Al-Nasir tried to rally support for another invasion. Nobody believed him anymore. The myth of Almohad invincibility was dead, and myths are what empires run on. In 1213, barely 6 months after Las Navas, Al-Nasir died. Some chronicles say natural causes. Others suggest poison. Either way, his death triggered a succession crisis that tore the Almohad Empire apart. Over the next 40 years, the empire collapsed, province by province, kingdom by kingdom, not because of military conquest, because of lost confidence, because Las Navas had proven they could be beaten, and once that was proven, everyone who'd been forced to submit started rebelling. By 1269, the Almohad Empire no longer existed. Its territories in North Africa were conquered by new dynasties. Its holdings in Spain were reduced to a few isolated kingdoms, and the Christian kingdoms that had been on the defensive for 5 centuries suddenly found themselves advancing. In 1236, Fernando III of Castile, Alfonso VIII's grandson, captured Córdoba, the city that had been the jewel of Islamic Spain, the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate, the most cultured, wealthy, advanced city in Western Europe for 300 years. Fernando rode in through gates that hadn't been breached in centuries. He went to the Great Mosque, one of the architectural wonders of the medieval world, and had it consecrated as a church. The Islamic call to prayer that had echoed from its minarets for 500 years fell silent, replaced by church bells. In 1248, Fernando took Seville, the Almohad capital in Spain, the city from which Al-Nasir had launched his invasion 36 years earlier. It surrendered after a 16-month siege. The Christian Reconquista, which had seemed dead after Alarcos in 1195, was now unstoppable, all because of what happened on a plateau in the Sierra Morena in July of 1212. But here's what's interesting. Las Navas wasn't won by superior numbers, or better equipment, or more resources. The Christians were outnumbered, outpositioned, fighting in enemy territory in summer heat with dwindling supplies. They won because of a decision. Alfonso's decision to charge up a hill when charging up that hill was insane. The military order's decision to follow him. The decision of thousands of individual soldiers to keep pushing when every instinct screamed to retreat. It was a collective choice to refuse defeat, and that choice, multiplied across an army, became stronger than any tactical advantage. The Almohads had everything except that. They had numbers, position, veterans, an undefeated record. But when their leader fled, they had nothing to hold them together. No shared conviction strong enough to override individual survival instinct. That's what made Las Navas different from other battles. It wasn't about tactics or technology, it was about will. And will, it turns out, can break empires. After Las Navas, the nature of warfare in Spain changed. Muslim kingdoms stopped trying to conquer, they started trying to survive. Christian kingdoms stopped defending, they started expanding. The military orders that had fought at Las Navas became rich and powerful. They received land grants, built castles, became kingmakers in Castilian politics. The Templars and Hospitallers used their Spanish holdings to fund operations in the Holy Land. The victory also changed how Christians thought about themselves. For centuries, they'd been on the defensive, reacting to Muslim raids, paying tribute to avoid invasion. Las Navas flipped the script. Suddenly, Christians were the aggressive force. Muslims were the ones paying tribute. It changed the psychology of the Reconquista, made it seem inevitable rather than impossible, made Christian victory feel like destiny rather than hope. But there was a darker side. Las Navas also hardened religious divisions. The battle was framed as Christian versus Muslim, faith versus faith, God's army against God's enemy. That framing would echo through centuries of Spanish history, through the Inquisition, through the expulsion of Muslims and Jews in 1492, through the idea that Spain's identity was fundamentally Catholic and anything else was foreign. Las Navas became not just a military victory, but a religious validation, proof that God favored Christians, that Islamic rule in Spain was against divine will, that violent expulsion of non-Christians was justified. Whether that interpretation was right or wrong, fair or unfair, is still debated. But it shaped how Spain understood itself for the next 800 years. In Muslim chronicles, Las Navas is remembered differently, not as a religious judgment, but as a military disaster, a failure of leadership, a moment when overconfidence met desperation and lost. Muslim historians criticized al-Nasir harshly for abandoning his men, for failing to scout Christian movements, for underestimating an enemy he'd been told was broken and defeated. There's a particularly scathing account by Ibn Idari, writing 50 years after the battle. Al-Nasir rode north with the arrogance of a man who had forgotten that victories must be earned, not assumed. He found an enemy who remembered how to bleed, and he learned too late that memory is stronger than confidence. The battlefield at Las Navas de Tolosa today is mostly farmland, wheat fields where men once died, olive groves planted over mass graves. There's a small monument, a museum in the nearby town, but nothing that captures the scale of what happened there. Stand there on a July afternoon, though, and you can feel it. The heat that killed as efficiently as swords, the terrain that funneled armies into killing grounds, the desperate geography that made one charge up one hill change the fate of a continent. 3 kings led 60,000 men through mountains to fight an empire. They should have lost. Every rational analysis said they'd lose. The numbers, the position, the track record. They won anyway, because sometimes desperation beats confidence. Sometimes the smaller army that has everything to lose fights harder than the larger army that has everything to gain. Al-Nasir fled. Alfonso stood. And that choice, repeated across thousands of individual soldiers, broke an empire that had ruled for a century and seemed destined to rule forever. The charge up that hill lasted maybe 30 minutes, but its echo lasted 3 centuries. From Las Navas in 1212 to Granada in 1492, every Christian advance in Spain was built on the understanding that Muslim armies could be beaten, that empires could fall, that willpower could overcome overwhelming odds. Alfonso VIII died 2 years after Las Navas in 1214. He was 58. He'd spent his entire adult life fighting the Moors, won some battles, lost others. But Las Navas was his masterpiece, his redemption for Alarcos, his proof that 17 years of patient preparation could turn humiliation into triumph. His tomb in the monastery of Las Huelgas, outside Burgos, bears an inscription. Here lies Alfonso VIII, who defeated the Saracens at Las Navas de Tolosa and liberated Spain. That second part was aspirational. Spain wouldn't be fully liberated, and if we accept that framing, for another 280 years. But Alfonso had started the process, proven it was possible, turned an impossible dream into an inevitable outcome. And all it took was a desperate charge up an impossible hill by men who'd run out of options and decided to die trying. January the 2nd, 1492. Granada, southern Spain. Boabdil, the last Muslim sultan in Western Europe, stood on the ramparts of the Alhambra and watched Christian banners rise over the towers his ancestors had built 5 centuries ago. Behind him, his advisors wept. His mother, legend says, told him he should weep like a woman for what he couldn't defend like a man. He was surrendering the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, the final remnant of 800 years of Islamic civilization on the Iberian Peninsula, the end of a story that had begun with conquest in 711 and was ending with capitulation in 1492. and it had all started to crumble 280 years earlier, on a July afternoon, on a plateau called Las Navas de Tolosa, when a desperate king made a suicidal charge up a hill and broke an empire's spine. This is the story of how that one battle's echo took 3 centuries to finally fall silent, and what it tells us about faith, strategy, and the long arc of history. Because Las Navas didn't drive the Moors out of Europe, it just proved it was possible. What came after? The grinding, decades-long campaign to actually finish the job. That's the part of the story nobody talks about. That's the part where glory turns into work. After Alfonso VIII died in 1214, the Reconquista didn't accelerate. It slowed. His son, Enrique Efar, died in a construction accident at age 13. Castile fell into a regency crisis. The momentum from Las Navas nearly died with it. But something had changed in the Christian kingdoms. A generation of young men had grown up hearing stories about Las Navas, about how their fathers and grandfathers had beaten an empire everyone said was invincible. Those stories created expectations. If we could do it once, why not again? Fernando III became King of Castile in 1217. He was 18 years old. His mother, Berenguela, reportedly told him on his coronation day, "Your grandfather won a great battle. Your job is to turn that battle into a kingdom." Fernando spent the next 35 years doing exactly that. He didn't fight one great battle. He fought dozens of small ones. Sieges that lasted months. Negotiations that took years. The slow, unglamorous work of conquest that doesn't make for epic poems but wins wars. In 1236, Fernando took Córdoba, not through a dramatic charge or miraculous intervention. Through logistics, he besieged the city, cut off its food supply, waited until hunger did what swords couldn't. When the gates opened, Fernando rode into a city that had been Islamic for over 500 years. The Great Mosque, the architectural marvel that had inspired Islamic architecture across the Mediterranean, was converted into a cathedral. Muslim scholars who'd preserved Greek philosophy and advanced mathematics fled or converted. A civilization didn't just lose territory, it lost its cultural center. 12 years later, Fernando took Seville. Another siege, another city starved into submission. The chroniclers paint it as divine favor. The reality was supply chains and patience. By the time Fernando died in 1252, he'd conquered more territory than any Castilian king in history. His tomb in Seville Cathedral bears inscriptions in 4 languages, Latin, Castilian, Arabic, and Hebrew, acknowledging the world he'd destroyed to build his kingdom. He was later canonized, Saint Fernando, patron saint of engineering, prisoners, and governors. The Catholic Church made him a saint for conquering Muslim kingdoms and converting mosques into churches. Make of that what you will. But here's the thing about the Reconquista after Las Navas. It wasn't really about religion anymore. It was about land, about power, about Christian kingdoms expanding their territory and tax base. Muslim kingdoms in Spain offered to convert, offered to pay tribute, offered to become vassal states. Christian kings refused, not because of faith, because conquest was more profitable than coexistence. The tragedy of medieval Spain, one of many tragedies, is that Las Navas could have been a negotiating point, a moment that led to peace treaties and coexistence. Instead, it became proof that total victory was possible. And once total victory seemed achievable, compromise became cowardice. The Muslim kingdoms that survived Fernando's conquests fragmented further. Murcia, Valencia, Jaén, each one making separate deals with Christian kingdoms, paying tribute, providing soldiers for Christian campaigns against other Muslims. The unity that might have resisted Christian expansion died with the Almohad Empire. What remained was small kingdoms trying to survive by playing Christian powers against each other. It worked for a while. Muslim Granada survived for another 240 years after Fernando's death, not because it was strong, because it was useful. Granada paid tribute to Castile, massive annual payments in gold. It was cheaper for Castilian kings to keep Granada as a cash cow than to conquer it and deal with administering a hostile Muslim population. So Granada survived. A wealthy, cultured, increasingly isolated island of Islamic civilization in a Christian sea. Its rulers built the Alhambra, one of the architectural wonders of the medieval world, while knowing that every stone they placed might be the last their dynasty would see. There's a melancholy to late-period Granada, a civilization that knew it was dying but kept creating beauty anyway. Poetry, architecture, science, mathematics, as if culture could be a shield against history. It couldn't. By the 1480s, Granada was the only Muslim kingdom left in Spain, and even its existence depended on Christian disunity. As long as Castile and Aragon were separate kingdoms, Granada could play them off each other, pay tribute to both, survive. Then, in 1469, Isabella of Castile married Ferdinand of Aragon. In 1479, they inherited both kingdoms. Suddenly, Christian Spain was united under two monarchs, Los Reyes Católicos, the Catholic monarchs, and they looked south at Granada and saw unfinished business. The war for Granada lasted 10 years, 1482 to 1492. It wasn't a war of great battles, it was a war of sieges, economic strangulation, psychological pressure. The Catholic monarchs didn't charge Granada's walls like Alfonso had charged at Las Navas. They built forts around every mountain pass, captured every town that supplied Granada with food, turned a kingdom into a city into a fortress into a prison. By 1491, Boabdil was negotiating surrender terms, not because he'd lost a battle, because he'd lost hope. Every year, Granada got smaller, poorer, hungrier. His people were starving, his army was deserting, his nobles were defecting to the Christians for land and titles. On November 25, 1491, Boabdil signed the Treaty of Granada. He would surrender the city. In exchange, Muslims would be allowed to keep their property, practice their religion, and live under their own laws. It was a lie. Within a decade, Muslims would be forced to convert or leave. Their mosques would be torn down, their books burned, their culture erased. But on January 2, 1492, as Boabdil handed over the keys to the Alhambra, that future was still hidden. He rode out of the city he'd surrendered, looked back once at the palace his family had built, and wept. There's a place near Granada called El Último Suspiro del Moro, the Moor's last sigh, the spot where Boabdil supposedly looked back at the city for the last time. It's a tourist attraction now. 800 years of Islamic Spain ended with a sigh and a set of keys. Ferdinand and Isabella entered Granada in triumph. They went to the palace mosque and had it consecrated as a church. They planted Christian banners on the Alhambra's towers. They sent word to Rome that the Reconquista, launched in 722, 770 years earlier, was finally complete. Pope Alexander VI gave them a new title, Los Reyes Católicos, the Catholic monarchs, champions of the faith, defenders against Islam. The same year, 1492, they signed the Alhambra Decree, expelling all Jews who wouldn't convert. Tens of thousands left. Most went to North Africa or the Ottoman Empire. They carried with them Spanish language and culture that survives to this day. Also in 1492, Isabella funded an Italian navigator who thought he could reach Asia by sailing west, Christopher Columbus. He left from Granada's port with ships and sailors who'd been freed up by the end of the Reconquista. Granada's fall funded the discovery of the Americas. The end of one world enabled the conquest of another. The connections are dizzying. Las Navas in 1212 broke Almohad power. That allowed Fernando to conquer Córdoba and Seville, which isolated Granada, which survived until Christian Spain unified, which fell in 1492, which freed resources for exploration, which led to colonization, which changed world history. One desperate charge up one hill, 280 years of consequences. But let's go back to Las Navas itself, because the battle has become a myth, and myths are dangerous. The chroniclers, Christian chroniclers, framed Las Navas as a miracle, God intervening on behalf of the faithful. The shepherd appearing to guide them through the mountains was an angel. Alfonso's charge up the hill was divine inspiration. The Almohad collapse was God's judgment. That narrative served a purpose. It made the Reconquista seem inevitable, ordained, right. It justified centuries of conquest and forced conversion as fulfilling divine will. But strip away the miracles and look at the tactics. Alfonso didn't win because God loved him more. He won because he chose better terrain, used his cavalry more effectively, and got lucky when Al-Nasir panicked. The shepherd who guided them through the mountains wasn't an angel. He was a local man who knew the trails and hated the Almohads. The charge up the hill worked because it concentrated force at the enemy's weakest point, their command structure. The Almohad collapse happened because medieval armies without their commander don't have command and control systems to maintain cohesion. It was good strategy, not divine intervention, but saying that doesn't make for a good story, doesn't inspire crusades, doesn't justify conquest. So the miracle narrative won. And here's where it gets complicated, because that narrative, Las Navas as divine judgment, shaped Spanish identity for centuries. Spain wasn't just a country, it was Catholic, essentially, definitionally. Anyone who wasn't Catholic was foreign, dangerous, other. That mentality led to the Inquisition, to the expulsion of Jews and Muslims, to centuries of religious persecution, to the idea that Spain's greatness was tied to its religious purity. Las Navas didn't cause all that, but the way Las Navas was remembered and mythologized enabled it, made it seem natural, holy, required. Modern Spain still wrestles with this. How do you honor your history when your history includes both great achievements and terrible atrocities? How do you celebrate La Reconquista without endorsing religious persecution? How do you acknowledge that for Christians it was liberation, while for Muslims and Jews it was ethnic cleansing? There's no easy answer. The past isn't simple. Las Navas was both a legitimate defensive victory and the beginning of 3 centuries of aggressive conquest. Fernando III was both a brilliant strategist and the destroyer of a civilization. The Reconquista was both the survival of Christian kingdoms and the elimination of religious diversity. History doesn't offer clean heroes and villains, just people making choices with consequences they couldn't fully see. But here's what we can say with clarity. Las Navas de Tolosa was a turning point. Before it, Christian kingdoms in Spain were on the defensive, surviving. After it, they were on the offensive, expanding. The battle didn't immediately drive the Moors out of Europe, but it created the conditions where that became possible. It broke Almohad power. It inspired Christian confidence. It set in motion a process that took 280 years to complete, but was, after Las Navas, probably inevitable. One battle, one charge, one hill, and the map of Europe changed forever. Now, if you've made it through all 3 parts of this story, you're clearly someone who values depth, nuance, and understanding history's complexity rather than just its highlights. That's exactly the kind of thinking we bring to every video on this channel. We don't just tell you who won and who lost. We explore why it mattered, what it cost, and how those echoes still shape our world today. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Join a community that believes history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the present and preparing for the future. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, because we're going to keep diving into the moments that changed everything. And trust me, there are plenty more stories like this one waiting to be told. The battlefield at Las Navas de Tolosa is quiet now. Farmland, a small memorial, tour buses bringing school groups who half listen to guides explaining what happened 800 years ago. but stand there long enough, and you can almost hear it. The drums, the screams, the sound of history bending. 3 Christian kings led an army through mountains to fight an empire. They were outnumbered, outpositioned, running out of supplies. Every rational calculation said they'd lose. They won because one king decided that losing on his feet was better than surviving on his knees. Because thousands of individual soldiers made the same choice. Because desperation, channeled correctly, becomes a weapon that breaks empires. The Almohad Empire lasted another 60 years after Las Navas, but it was already dead. It just didn't know it yet. When al-Nasir fled that battlefield, he didn't just lose a battle. He lost the thing empires run on, the belief in their own invincibility. Once that belief breaks, everything else collapses. Slowly at first, then all at once. Granada fell in 1492, but really it fell in 1212. The last 280 years were just the echo of what happened on that July afternoon when Alfonso charged up a hill and an empire started to crumble. And the lesson, the one that echoes through every century since, is that no power is permanent, no empire is eternal, no advantage is insurmountable. Sometimes all it takes is one desperate charge, one impossible stand, one group of people who refuse to accept that defeat is inevitable. Alfonso wasn't a better general than the Almohad commanders. His army wasn't better equipped. His cause wasn't necessarily more just. But he made a choice. At the moment when retreat seemed rational and attack seemed suicidal, he attacked anyway, and that choice changed everything. The Spanish have a saying, no hay enemigo pequeño. There is no small enemy. Las Navas proved it. A smaller army in the right place with enough conviction can break a larger force. But here's the harder lesson. The one we avoid because it's uncomfortable. Las Navas also proved that victory doesn't mean you were right, that winning doesn't make your cause just, that historical success isn't the same as moral correctness. The Christians won. They drove the Muslims out of Spain. They built a unified Catholic kingdom that became a world power. By any measure of historical success, they won. But they also destroyed libraries, burned books, expelled populations, erased cultures, created a religious monoculture that persecuted anyone who didn't fit. Can both be true? Can Las Navas be both a legitimate defensive victory and the starting point of centuries of persecution? Yes, because history is complicated, because people and nations contain multitudes, because the same event can be salvation for some and catastrophe for others. Alfonso VIII probably didn't think about that as he charged up the hill. He was trying to survive, to protect his kingdom, to avenge a defeat that had haunted him for 17 years. He succeeded, and his success set in motion events he never lived to see. Consequences that rippled across centuries, some good, some terrible, all connected back to that moment when he refused to retreat. That's the weight of historical decisions. You never see the full impact, never know the complete cost. You just make the choice and hope. Alfonso chose to fight. Al-Nasir chose to flee. And Europe became Christian instead of Muslim. Would a Muslim Spain have been better or worse? Impossible to say. History doesn't offer do-overs or simulations. We only get the one timeline. The one where Alfonso charged, Al-Nasir fled, and 800 years of coexistence ended in conquest and expulsion. We can study it, learn from it, try to understand what happened and why, but we can't change it, can only decide what lessons to carry forward. So what are the lessons? That desperation can beat confidence, that smaller forces with greater conviction can overcome superior numbers, that empires fall not just through military defeat, but through psychological collapse, that winning one battle doesn't end wars, it just creates the conditions for winning campaigns. And maybe the hardest lesson, that the line between heroism and atrocity is often just a matter of perspective, that yesterday's freedom fighters are tomorrow's oppressors. That victory doesn't make you right, it just makes you powerful. Las Navas de Tolosa was 800 years ago. The men who fought there are dust. Their kingdoms are museums. Their causes are footnotes in history books. But the choice they faced, stand or retreat, fight or surrender, risk everything or accept defeat, that choice is timeless. Every generation faces it. Every person faces it. The specifics change, but the fundamental question remains. When the odds are against you and retreat is rational, do you stand anyway? Alfonso said yes, charged up a hill that should have been his grave, and changed the world. 8 centuries later, we're still living in the world his choice created, still debating whether it was heroism or madness, still trying to understand how one desperate charge on one July afternoon echoed through 3 centuries and reshaped a continent. The Christian kingdoms won, built an empire, discovered new worlds, spread their culture and religion across the globe. The Muslim kingdoms lost, were conquered, expelled, survived as minorities or refugees or memories. And somewhere in that story, between the triumph and the tragedy, between the glory and the cost, is the truth about what happened at Las Navas de Tolosa. 3 kings led an army against an empire. They should have lost. They won. And Europe would never be the same. End of part 3. The charge up that impossible hill. The collapse of an empire that had seemed eternal, the slow, grinding campaign that turned one battle into the conquest of a civilization. Las Navas de Tolosa wasn't just a battle. It was a moment when history pivoted, when the future that had seemed inevitable, Islamic expansion, Christian retreat, suddenly reversed. One charge, one hill. 280 years of consequences. And the question that echoes still when faced with impossible odds, do you retreat to fight another day, or do you charge, knowing you'll probably die but choosing to die trying? Alfonso charged. And in charging he drove the Moors out of Europe, not in a day, not in a year, but eventually, inevitably, because sometimes one impossible stand is enough to change everything.